The leaders at the G7 summit have committed to a green revolution that would limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They also promised to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, halve the emissions by 2030, and to conserve or protect at least 30% of land and oceans by 2030. For more reaction on the G7 summit pronouncement on climate change, we are now joined by Parr, the Policy Director for Greenpeace UK from Oxford in the United Kingdom. Mr. Parr, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Pleasure.
Now, climate change was a key focus of the leaders' final day of talks, with the G7 countries formally backing the ramp-up of collective action to tackle the environmental crisis. So should we be worried that the G7 failed to set a firm end date on the use of coal, the burning of which is one of the biggest contributors to global warming?
Yes, we should. There were one or two good things about the summit, but the overriding sense must be one of disappointment for the reason you outlined, which is collectively they haven't been able to say when they're going to get rid of the most polluting fuel, which is coal. They also did no more than reheat the promises they made over a decade ago about financing the least developed countries to come through the climate problems that are going to be facing them, both in terms of averting their own emissions and also adapting to what is now the inevitable changes that are coming. Now, even the 100 billion that they once again promised that they would deliver is probably nowhere near enough. And there was also no real commitment on new money for looking after nature, which, as increasingly scientists reiterate, the nature and climate crises are intimately linked. So we need a lot of money, and the rich nations really need to step up.
Now, the International Monetary Fund, Mr. Parr, is exploring creation of a new trust that could allow its members to lend their IMF reserves to more countries, including the middle-income countries vulnerable to climate change. So what's your reaction to those developments?
Well, we have felt that the special drawing rights would be a useful supplement. But our overriding focus has actually been on trying to ensure that the rich nations are actually contributing rather than this being a case of loans. As I think the president, the clip you just played of the president was quite right in saying that many of the least developed countries are actually suffering the most whilst contributing the least. And we think as a matter of historic responsibility, which is actually not disputed. Even I watched Boris Johnson's press conference. He does not dispute the fact that there is a historic responsibility on countries like the UK to contribute to the changes that need to happen. So, I think if those who are financing the necessary projects feel the special drawing rights are going to help, and I think we'd think yes, they probably would. That's good, and it's a step, but it's not the sort of step that we need.
All right. And after a summit in Britain, G7 leaders also promised to help developing countries move away from coal. But just how feasible is this move away from coal for developing countries? I mean, the G7 will end the funding of new coal generation in developing countries and offer up to 2 billion euros to stop using the fuel.
Yeah, so, I mean, if we look at the assessments done by analysts like Bloomberg, who are the leading analysts of the clean energy space, I mean, they are already saying the cheapest form of generation in around 2/3 of countries is now wind or solar, or indeed both. So in terms of new investment, most countries, and increasingly very few countries, are going to find that it's cheaper to invest in fossil fuel than it is to invest in the wind and solar, which have been coming down the cost curve so rapidly. The fact that it doesn't happen, and there are places it doesn't happen, is partly to do with grids. It's partly to do with, frankly, vested interests. So I would be very surprised if most countries in Africa don't find it's actually cheaper to go down the clean energy route than to go down the coal route. So they're only sort of following in the wake of where technology is leading us, which is not to say it's not a good thing, but as the thrust of your question indicated, what we need to see is not just a stop to funding coal, we also need a sort of proactive attempt to fund the efficiency and clean energy that would take its place.
Yeah, and having said that, Mr. Parr, what should the other countries which are outside of the G7 bracket do in order to be part of a global collective strategy to retire coal within the developing nations?
Well, I think all of these things take place within individual national contexts. So each of those countries, and we have also thought that this is an important part of climate finance, is the capacity building to help all countries of whatever stage of development to develop their own plans for how they're going to make that transition, and to understand the kind of clean energy finance and grid finance that is going to be necessary. So I think it's obviously down to individual sovereign governments to prepare the plans for their own countries, which they know best. And but what I would say is that there is value in African countries, for example, banding together and demanding this of the richer nations. Well, now the G7 has gone at the next stage at the Conference of the Parties in November, where climate will be front and center of the discussion.
Let's talk about the countries that do not develop the requisite foreign and trade relations capacity to claim a stake, of course, in the investment surge in decarbonized technology, innovation and infrastructure. How would these countries fare in the quest of the world to live in a cleaner environment?
Well, in general, I think all countries who can make that transition to cleaner energy are going to find that they have a host of what are known as co-benefits. So, clean energy like wind and solar do not use water in the way that fossil fuel power stations do, very often needing clean water, which is often in short supply. They will also find that they have reduced air pollution, and I think one of the most recent estimates was that about 1/8 of deaths globally is caused by air pollution. So there's an awful lot of ill health associated with it. So there are benefits associated with that transition that are not simply to do with climate. They're increasingly to do with the cleaner environment that has tangible economic benefits, as well as the fact that the clean energy is now cheaper too. So this is about the capacity to be able to make those changes, rather than it being a kind of bad thing to be doing. So that's why I keep pointing out that it's necessary for those countries where they can to band together and be politically active and pressure the G7. I mean, we'll do our bit in the UK, of course, but actually, while we have many criticisms of the UK on some of these subjects, they could be a lot worse. And to pressure the richer nations at the upcoming COP to make that kind of funding available.
So what's your analysis of whether an emphasis was made on the centrality of the Paris Agreement, to reinforce the importance of multilateralism?
Well, they certainly did reiterate the goals, of the Paris Agreement, and they had some commitments on emissions reductions, which were certainly not negligible. I think in this instance, though, what we're worried about is that, so if we take a step back from the Paris Agreement, there's the financing piece, which we've talked about, and then there's the commitment to reduce emissions. Now, on the commitment to reduce emissions, the question now is much more about delivery, because the UK, for example, and other countries like the US are making commitments, headline commitments, to say yes, we're going to do the emissions reductions. But sitting here in the UK, I cannot see the plan that's going to make those happen. So we go to the G7, we go to the conference of the parties later this year, and the headlines look very good. But unless you've got the stuff that's sitting underneath it, the financing, the policies, the capacities, the supply chains, the skills, then you can have all the commitments you like. It isn't going to happen. And so I think increasingly in developed countries, we're seeing this pivot to stop talking about headlines and headline commitments and start looking at where the rubber hits the road on getting that money and policy together to make it happen.
You know, in some countries, carbon emissions form the bedrock of some countries' economies.
Yeah.
So I suppose it'll be a very tough balancing act, leading a cleaner environment and taking into cognizance the livelihoods of its people through the economy.
Yes, it will. There are an uncomfortably large number of countries who are highly dependent on fossil fuel incomes to enable their economies, and that's not always just developing countries. I mean, think Australia, think Russia, think Saudi Arabia. So when we talk about the just transition, there are multiple levels of the just transition, which is going to be an essential part of the change that we see. There's a just transition between countries, there's a just transition within countries, and there's a just transition geographically and within between rich and poor. So these are multi-dimensional aspects of the transition that we need to see. But if you think about those countries, well, look, it's time that they accepted that the need to diversify. So if you're a Russia or a Saudi Arabia has sort of hinted that they need to go this way and keep making large pronouncements about solar. You actually have to start thinking very practically, what is my alternative economy going to look like? Because, otherwise those countries are going to be left high and dry in a very poor state. Because in the end, their product is not going to be needed, and indeed can't be needed if we have a climate that is stable enough and safe enough to continue with the sort of civilizations that we have at the moment, because the political and health consequences of going well above 1.5 degrees are pretty worrying.
All right. Mr. Parr, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your thoughts.